waiting reminds us that God is God.
Yeah.
And that God is uncontrollable. And that we don't get to control God. So we're waiting for God to speak, to move. And that is an anticipation. That's an attentiveness. So it's not waiting as apathy. It's not waiting, for a delayed flight.
No.
It is waiting with a distinct story, waiting to see something, waiting to anticipate something, waiting actually to be called.
Hey, leuk dat je luistert naar de podcast Begrijpend Leven, waarin we met elkaar nadenken over de vragen van geloof, de kerk en de Bijbel rondom jongvolwassenen. Dat doen we vandaag met Andrew Root, die bij ons is, en Bart de Zwaan. Andrew Root is een praktisch theoloog en professor in Youth and Family Ministry aan het Luther Seminary in Minnesota in de Verenigde Staten. De afgelopen jaren schreef hij verschillende boeken, prikkelende boeken eigenlijk, over de praktijk van kerk-zijn. Hij focust zich daarbij op leiderschap en jeugdwerk in relatie tot de tijd waarin wij leven. Hij schrijft veel over secularisatie en wetenschap, maar recent schreef hij een boek eigenlijk voor iedereen die iets doet in de kerk, Wachten op God. Waarin hij stelt dat veel kerken de uitdagingen van deze tijd proberen op te lossen met de problemen die deze tijd veroorzaken. Nou, ik ga met hem in gesprek samen met Bart de Zwaan, vandaag mijn co-host. Bart is onderzoeker naar de Millennial Challenge, een methode waarin jongvolwassenen samen op zoek gaan naar de betekenis van de Bijbel voor het alledaagse leven. Mijn naam is Marijn Vlasblom, ik ben coördinator van diezelfde challenge. Nou, ik zei het al even, onze podcastgast is dus vandaag Andrew Root. En hij verstaat geen Nederlands, dus wij spreken vandaag Engels. Mocht je dat nou echt heel moeilijk kunnen volgen, kijk dan even onze podcast op YouTube. Er staat precies hetzelfde gesprek, maar daar kun je de automatische vertaling onder zetten en dan krijg je ondertitels erbij. Goed ook even om te noemen is dat we deze podcast opnemen op de ochtend van 5 november. Dat is de dag van de presidentsverkiezingen in de Verenigde Staten. Gezien het tijdsverschil met de Verenigde Staten hebben we daar in deze ochtend nog geen uitslagen van. Goed om dat even te noemen. En dan switchen wij nu naar het Engels. Andrew, welcome. Good to have you today. I think today is a day of tension and suspension for a lot of your fellow countrymen. How do you experience this day, being in the Netherlands?
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Well, as we're recording this, it's early morning on November 5th. So, yeah, it's gonna be a weird day. It's strange because in 2016, I was also out of the country.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I was in Sweden in 2016, and I sat down. I was having dinner, and I told pastors and professors, I said, listen, there's no way Donald Trump will be elected. He'll get more votes than you think or than any of us think, but he will not be elected. And of course, 6 hours later, he was announced as president.
Did you
of the United
vote
States.
then?
I had voted yes. So you can early
vote. It's not
vote.
your fault.
No, it was my he won by one vote. And it was in Minnesota. No, so I mean, there's a weird kind of symmetry, I guess, to being like out of the country now 2 elections later, and Trump trying to get back into the presidency to be here. So I'm making no predictions because
I can imagine.
I
won't ask you to.
But I think there's a lot of tension, but it's all ultimately it just all feels very peculiar, you know, like in how to even react and how to even think about what's going to come. Because I think, the tradition has always been by the end of Tuesday night,
Exactly.
And I just am very doubtful that will be the case, that this is so much of a coin flip election that I don't think we would know regardless. But then, of course, Trump is already sowing the seeds that there's some foul play going on.
Exactly.
So, and even with the Trump-Biden election, we didn't know until the weekend when it finally happened. This could even be longer, and it's going to. The country's already so divided; it's going to be divided further by this. So
maybe the whole country has to wait.
Talking
about waiting.
Absolutely. And there is a certain way that waiting makes people angry. Like telling people to wait can make people quite angry, and it's it's a very kind of frustrated, angry society overall. So
how do you remain hopeful in this time of waiting? Then?
Yeah, I mean, I think. I don't know. I mean, I think there's, in some sense, as a Christian, I'm very, very confident that God's mercy and God's grace and God's kingdom is beyond all partisan politics. So there's some hope there for me personally, but I don't know. I think we're all a little bit just dizzy, and so it's hard to know what to think going forward. I guess I don't know. Maybe that will become clearer in the next couple weeks. So I don't know.
Does that also mean that you just tend to disengage with what's going on and live your life?
In some ways, and I think that's just true in the midst of everything. Is that human beings just live their lives no matter what's occurring. I think the one interesting thing about the American consciousness is there's a certain perception that the structures, particularly the political structures, are made of granite. Like they can't be shaken. There's a certain way that the American consciousness, because of the way those two big oceans play and the kind of American exceptionalism, is that like the American political system that goes back to the Declaration of Independence and all of our documents, that really it's so strong that even a despot like Trump can't really shake it. So there's very little kind of social imagination that whole systems get turned over. Like where I think if you're a European, you can kind of know, like beginning of the 20th century in Germany, they went through multiple different systems, from a monarchy to a republic to a fascist leader. Like that all happened within like 8-9 years, and like whole systems can be can be pulled over. And for us, it's like 300 years. It's been a pretty solid system, and I think that leads to a certain, I don't want to say apathy, but it leads to a certain kind of like, well, we really don't like those people, and then let's get this bad person to do something to this system, but the system will be okay. We'll just get, I don't know, we'll get the bad people out of there. I don't think that we really come to grips with what the ramifications of kind of the whole democratic system could mean for us internally, and I can then only imagine what that means outside for the rest of the world, looking at what happens if, like it or not, the American military might is and economic might is everywhere, and what happens if all of a sudden they're not a trustworthy player. Now, how trustworthy we ever were is a question, but it at least seemed like there was a veil of trying to have decorum, and now that who knows what happens now. So
I think that's also part of the way in which a lot of people in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, they view this election in the United States. The European perspective is like, well, it's really crazy. How can they let him run again? How can they do this?
A convicted criminal.
Exactly. I was talking to my dad last weekend, and I was like, well, he's either going to win or he's going to end up in jail. It's one of the two. And it's really weird that you can have that situation in a country. But it's also funny to hear you say, well, as an American, we think it's kind of weird as well. Yeah. That's hopeful in a way.
And it does show you, I mean, because I study Bonhoeffer and am a Bonhoeffer scholar, so would not say I'm a kind of World War II German era scholar in any way, but I have to read some of that stuff to try to understand the Bonhoeffer reality. And one of the just the fascinating things that's, I think, haunted the West since the Nazification of Germany is, what do you do when a certain party or a certain group plays the game, plays the democratic game? I mean, the Nazis were elected. They played the system. But once they get in, they decide not to play by the rules. So you're playing football, but then you're like,
if we win, we're
going to play with two balls. There's no offsides for us. We can, you blow the whistle for offside, we don't care. We're not gonna obey any of that. What are the internal structures to make sure that doesn't happen? And we don't really have them. There was a goodwill that whoever the parties were, that they would have the goodwill of saying, oh, we lost a fair election, so we're going to step out. Or if we're convicted of a crime, we'll be shameful and be like, I can't take public office. If you just simply say, nope, and deny it, there's nothing inherent, I think, at least within our system, that would regulate that kind of behavior. And so and that's something I think that's haunted the West since the 1930s. Is what do you do when someone will play the quote unquote democratic game, but then not obey the rules of it? You know, and
what system of checks and balances do you have?
Right. Yeah. And so, you know, like you say, well, he's a convicted, he's convicted, he'll go to jail. Well, before that happens, he just keeps on saying, well, I mean, how corrupt that you would imprison a political rival. And of course, you do look at it from that perspective, and that's exactly what fascists would do, is you imprison and you know, and so it just, the whole kind of sense of truth or reliability within the social discourse is just all thrown up in the air. And so at one level, you just to kind of cope, and then you have social media where it's just bombarding on you all the time, is you kind of have to step back and realize you can't control it, you know, in many ways. And that's the hard part.
You mentioned the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which is also very well read in the Netherlands. Dietrich Bonhoeffer also is, of course, known for a lot of his thinking about Christianity in the future. Also about believing in time where believing is not normal anymore. So we also, with that, we have a new movie coming up. I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer is now claimed by, as well as the Republicans, as the Democrats. So there's this whole discussion going on. In a lot of your writings, you also write about secularization. So the process, in my own words, of de-churching. How do you see a connection? Do you see a connection with that process of secularization in the United States and the rhetoric of these elections?
I think so. I think really what seems obvious to some of us, and even more so, I think, to some scholars, religious studies scholars and things like that, is it feels like partisan politics has become religion for people. Like it has become the most kind of core identity marker that separates them from others or connects them to others. You know, so maybe this would be before my time, but even say in the middle of the 20th century, even in the American context, there might be like Protestant Catholic. Like, is it okay if your daughter marries a Catholic? What does that mean? How do we make sense of that? Our neighborhood is mainly a Catholic neighborhood. How do we feel about, you know, there's all those kind of dynamics that were still there, probably more like in places in like Ireland or something more obviously than in the U.S. But that was still kind of there. And now it's completely shifted to, are you red or are you blue? And it really does function for people in a kind of as a kind of overarching meaning system that kind of frames their lives, that they take on almost kind of doctrinal commitments to it. They have certain saints that kind of connect to it. So it does have a kind of functional religious perspective that I think holds on within it. So there's something about the kind of receding of frameworks of religion that other things take their place. But I also think what's kind of fascinating about it is some people hold on to those and they have a kind of spirituality to it. You know, like the whole QAnon thing is a little bit like there's a bigger story at play here that you don't really see. And, you know, that there's a whole cabal of things happening. And then other people, it's built off of kind of deep forms of resentment and revenge, and so there's sense of who's a sinner and who's a not. All of that really plays in. So I think in the ways of thinking of secularization, that it becomes a new kind of form of spirituality. And I think one of the main dynamics of what it means to live in a secular age is not that spirituality or even religion becomes pushed out, but the options escalate. So now you have all sorts of different options. And somehow, I mean, maybe this is all coming undone, but somehow Western societies can still function with people believing very different things. And all those beliefs are somewhat relativized. So if your spirituality is like being connected to a YouTube channel on aliens, then that's totally legitimate as being a practicing Catholic in some ways. So it's not this kind of, to be secular isn't to push spirituality or even kind of forms of religion out of our lives. It is to make a surplus of them, and in some sense say they're all kind of, for the most part, the same. And as long as they work for you, that's good.
Fine.
But they're also still connected a lot to traditional religion, right? I mean, it's from a Dutch context, it's almost impossible to think that in Dutch elections, themes like abortion would play such a big role as they do in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's also very caught up in both parties, I think. But
and
It's
that
very
I think,
divisive.
and I think that is one of the interesting, since we're talking about the American political system, is one of the things that Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, who I think has written the most interesting stuff on what it means to live in a secular age. He has a chapter in a book called Dilemmas and Conflicts, where he talks about the American exception. Yeah. So he says, looking across the West, so he's always thinking of what he calls the leftovers of Latin Christendom. Yeah. So, all the kind of Western European societies, South American, North American societies that came out of Catholic Western Christianity. Yeah. He says, America is the exception because you still have a high number of people who at least report that they go to church. What does that have to do with? And so he tries to explore that. And one of the more convincing elements I think that he gets at with the American exception is that there's really no sense in the American consciousness of any kind of remembrance of any kind of ancient regime, of any kind of world where there were kings and queens, and the world was ordered under the domain of that. Like in the American consciousness, that just does not exist. So even you go to Canada, and I had an experience of going into BC and Canada to Kelowna. It was this beautiful little mountain town. Yeah. Flew in there, went through customs, and there above the customs officer was a picture of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, this was before she had died. And I remember feeling like, what the heck? Wow. What are you doing, Canada? I thought I knew you so well. What's the Queen doing up there? Yeah. Because in the American mind, it's like there may be a little bit of interest in British royalty as celebrity, but there's just really no sense of that. So Taylor's point is that's always made religion in the American mind de facto, the people's, and never de jure by law. I mean, it's never been there. And because it's not there, then to be a person who's connected to religion in some way means you're just one of the people. So this is why every American president has to be Donald Trump said, my favorite book is the Bible, as he held it upside down. Like that. Yeah. And part of that is to say, I'm not an elite. I'm one of the people, where the kind of European experience has been quite different. And the American Revolution, it happened and it took. Where the French Revolution, it came and stops and starts. And so that's given America, I think, this weird kind of conception that religion is ours. It's what normal people do, but then it's from its beginning become quite contested reality too.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So it becomes a bit of a cultural phenomenon then. People being really religious.
It holds civic power, I guess is a way to say it. It kind of holds civic power. But even that's now starting to be contested in certain ways and negotiated in different ways, because a lot of this hyper-spirituality that a late modern conception has, I think you can trace back to a certain kind of late 1960s California vibe. This kind of desire to find your own self-expression, to be authentic in yourself.
Kind of hippie Christianity.
Yeah. In a lot of, I think, our spiritualities that kind of migrate throughout the West. They have other centers, obviously, Berlin played its place, and Paris had its, there were other kind of centers of bohemianism that played in, but particularly the kind of hippie countercultural move is very kind of, it's a California kind of vibe, and you do get even new forms of Christianity that pop up in California in the late 20th century. I mean, the kind of, in some sense, the megachurch movement, the prosperity gospel, all of Pentecostalism starts in Azusa Street. All that stuff has a certain kind of California vibe, which is to find this authentic way of being.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Now we understand a little bit better, maybe, the American system. We'll see how it plays out this week.
Yeah. Thanks for the therapy. I appreciate it. Yeah.
But also good to know a little bit more about you. You're a practical theologian. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I'm sure some people would say I'm a bad practical theologian. In some sense, what it means to be a practical theologian is the contested definition of what practical theology is. Mm-hmm. I think for me, ultimately, what it means to be a practical theologian is to attend to the concrete, to attend to. Some people would say practical theology is really theology about practice. Some would say it's about empirical analysis. It's kind of an empirical form of theology. I would, for myself, what keeps me defining myself as a practical theologian is I always want to be able to get as on the ground as I can in concrete experience. How is this lived out? How do congregations, but even just larger people within society, kind of live that out? I tend to work more with philosophical categories and kind of philosophical genealogies than most practical theologians do. They tend to work more with kind of sociological and ethnographic methods, and I tend to work more in other veins. That's why some would probably say I'm not a great practical theologian, because I don't work those kind of ethnographic and sociological methods as much. But I would argue that what it means to be a practical theologian is to always be driving towards the kind of concreteness of how this all plays out in relation to the church and in society and how God moves within it. And I think that's my particular flavor as a practical theologian. Is I'm really interested in how we concretely think about how people in their practical lives encounter the presence and even the absence of God. And so I want God to be the object of study. And I think once you start to work with a lot of kind of social scientific methods, the social sciences, all going back to Max Weber's fact-value split. That theology can't deal with facts. It can only deal with the values. Right. So then, therefore, if you want to have an empirical theology and deal with facts, you kind of have to put the values behind. And I'm trying to do practical theology without kind of conceding to the fact-value split a bit and make God an actual object that an object of study, that God's pure subjectivity becomes an object of which we can examine. So how do people in their day-to-day lives encounter the presence of God? How do we think about that? How do we make sense of that?
So that means that in your view and your way of working, practical theology is a kind of doing theology in a way that's bottom up, that starts from the lived experience of people in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, ultimately, absolutely. And it's just how we get to describing the day-to-day that sometimes is different across the way people do practical theology.
And you seem to focus you write a lot of books, and a lot of your recent books are pointed towards younger generations or leadership. Why is that such a focus to you? How did you get involved with the younger generation? Yeah,
well, really, I mean, that's kind of what led me into academia. Is I was a youth worker, and really I don't know if it would be right to say kind of coming to faith, but for sure a kind of call into ministry happened as a young person, being asked to minister and be part of a youth ministry with younger people, like working with children as I was, a teenager. And so I really felt a call to ministry that way, and went to university and thought, well, I'll be a youth worker someday. And then the big academic ideas kind of got a hold of me. So I never went into this thinking, I want to be an academic. I went into this thinking, I want to be a minister. I'm called to do ministry. So, I started studying youth ministry and was writing on youth ministry. But really, the push always from the beginning was to remind people or to point out to people that youth ministry is a form of ministry, and ministry is a theological reality. That ministry isn't a functional thing. It isn't a kind of a social service. That ministry is a reality where humans and God at work. And so youth ministry isn't even just trying to be a kind of marketing wing of the church. Like, how do we get younger people? That it really is a concrete ministerial reality. That
it's a form of priesthood of believers.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's a form of priesthood in that way, that it touches really the divine working. That God is a minister, and to participate in God's own being is to do ministry. So it isn't a way of just trying to fill the pews of the next generation. It's really what it means for us to stand before and live before God. So it really was young people that took me into thinking of larger questions of secularity, because doing some research, even though I've been accused of not doing enough social scientific research, doing some. I had a project on science that we interviewed a bunch of young people, and we tried to make sense of how they were talking. All of a sudden, Charles Taylor's ideas were like, gosh, this sounds so much like his book, A Secular Age. And that started to open up to really becoming a major dialogue partner and taking the next step. I mean, it's always been there, of trying to think of ministry in this really broad way. So it's through youth ministry to thinking about all of ministry.
So you work a lot with young people, with youth workers. You write also a lot of books for them, very practical books, but also philosophical books. I read some areas of it. Really interesting. I'm curious. You're a little bit older than we are, so you have
thanks, guys.
A little bit. Sorry, but I mean, the generations, they are coming and going. Do you see that question of Charles Taylor's Secular Age, do you see that behaving any differently in the younger generations? For instance, the millennials like we are, or even Gen Z at the moment, maybe Gen Alpha, which is upcoming youth within now and 5 years. Could you point out some of maybe the differences or regarding secularization?
I think... Well, at one level, I think it's really hard to discern that, partly because like Generation Z and Generation Alpha or whatever are just too new to completely know. And then I also think, I mean, this is a total academic thing to say, but generational theory is really helpful, and it also is not helpful. You know what I mean? Like, the way human beings act and the way societies are structured are more than just kind of purely generational, and yet there does seem to be something about different generations. So, so with that caveat, I mean, I think what I'd really say a major difference is in an interaction with economic structures in a certain way. Like, I think particularly early millennials had a very much a kind of a sense of positivity when it came maybe even to themselves. There was a lot of, as the kids would say, a lot of shade thrown on early millennials back in the day, because they would be like, just started at the corporation. Like, my goal is to be the CEO, or like would apply for jobs that they had no experience on, right? And one of the things we're seeing with Gen Zers, I think, again, remember painting with really broad strokes here, is there's much more of a kind of disposition of nihilism. Like, just there's not a positivity. There's not a kind of trusting the system. There's a kind of hopelessness on it. Now, one of the ways that I would interpret that, there's a really interesting book that I've been writing on that fits into all the secularization theory by an American economist named Robert Gordon, and the book is called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his basic point is that from 1870 to 1970, really across Europe too, but particularly in America, there was unprecedented growth. And what he means by that is like GDP growth, which meant standard of living. So if you were in the 1960s, if you're a baby boomer, like, you would see your standard of living more than double than your parents. Actually, 2 times. Because if GDP growth is at 3%, the standard of living will like double. I think it's something like every 30 years or something like that. When it's at 2%, it will double. But when it goes under 2%, you will not see that exponential advance in standard of living. Now, what happened with millennials, which is fascinating, is that growth ends in 1970. It goes below 2%. But there was one 10-year period where it got back above 2%. And it was between 94 and 2004. And it was the dot-com revolution that then popped. But what's I think interesting is early millennials were coming of age in the potential of growth, standard of living made them really optimistic. Well, Gen Zers, I think, are pretty angry. And
there's a baseline of despair. And
they just know that there's no way that they will ever have standard of living beyond their parents. That we've been below 2%, and real GDP is what that measure is. It's an inflation-adjusted measure. And so I think that makes them just look at the future and feel like the kind of consumer American capitalist goods that you were supposed to receive have not been there. And yet they still have to play the neoliberal game. So they still have to work their butts off. They have to work harder. There's a kind of frenetic pace. And this gets us into the kind of Heart Roses stuff. Like you have to work harder and harder just to stay in place. Not even to advance. Like I think a lot of Gen Zers feel like outdoing my parents, living in a better state, that's not going to happen for me. But I also am exhausted just to stay in place. So you get these kind of terribly cringy TikTok videos of Gen Zers like, this isn't fair, I quit, and then all us older people are like, you're dumb and you're just lazy. Right. But their point is a kind of sense of despair. Like they're the whole point of this kind of secularized Western culture is that you could, especially in the American context, that you could make it.
Advance.
You could advance. You could have a high standard of living. And that just feels more and more like a lottery. It feels very...
So it's not sustainable anymore, whereas the previous generations still embody this sort of message, which is why you have this generational split almost. Because
Yeah. So you get like, the Seattle grunge move and even of kind of the gangster rap move, which was really to say like, actually this isn't all good. But then you get the jump in the mid 90s where it leads kind of millennials to be like, well, I could be a CEO. I could do this. But then that all pops too. And now this next generation is just, they just don't believe it. And then of course you have ecological crisis. You have populist kind of despots kind of rising across the West, and it's like, I don't see a lot of hope here. No. So
future's bleak.
Futures is bleak, and that and that becomes a huge issue. Is there have been bleaker times across the West? Like you think of the plague. The Black Plague was a pretty bleak time when whole villages were wiped out and a third of European population is gone. There were deep bleak times, and and the church was struggling at that time too. You had two popes. You had all sorts of things happening, but there was a larger kind of structure of meaning in place. Whether it was corrupted or not, there was a sense where there was a kind of divine movement of things. Now, for the most part, you don't have that. For the most part now, you kind of choke on the meaninglessness. So it's a kind of double whammy, I think, to Gen Zers.
Don't any hopeful narratives anymore. There's no horizon that you work towards and live towards.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like during the time of the plagues, you get all this new kind of perspective on the suffering of Christ and the grace of the Madonna. That's a way of giving meaning to this utter chaos. Well, inside of a late capitalist age, what kind of hope do you, is there any kind of larger narratives and frames that can do that?
You become a nihilist, really.
Yeah.
I don't want to step over this too quickly, but let's move a little bit towards hope.
Right.
Because I think it's interesting. You wrote a book. It's called Waiting for God, which sounds really.
In Dutch, it's called Waiting for God.
The Dutch phrase is translation is called Waiting for God. It's like an easy yes. I mean, how could you say no to that? In the English title is When the Church Stops Working. So I'm wondering if everything you're saying about this younger generations and the malleability of the world. The Dutch word is maakbaarheid. That we seem to kind of notice that we don't have control over this world anymore, or at least we thought it was all just an illusion. That's something you address in your book as well, quite a lot actually. But my first question is going for the English title of your book. When the church stops working, do churches stop working and why? That's your ground thesis.
And there's a kind of well, some readers have picked it up, some haven't, that there's a double meaning to when the church stops working.
Yeah.
You know, at one level, you should read it descriptively, and therefore it becomes a good title because it becomes very clickbait. You know, like, my church isn't working, and it doesn't feel like the church is working well. Yeah. Just like, you know, my computer isn't working. You know, like it's not functioning. The device is not working.
I need to fix this.
Yeah, it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
That's at one level. But what we're really getting at more prescriptively is that inside a crisis, there is a tendency to kind of frenetically try to just do anything. That, you know, like you think about someone who's drowning, they're just flaring to, and they become very dangerous to try to save because they'll knock you out, you know, because they're just panicking.
Right.
And so one of the things we're trying to prescriptively get at is there are deep theological wells here of what it means to stop, of what it means to not work as hard. I mean, that sounds very anti, you know, Protestant work ethic. You know what I mean? Yeah. But there a sense of maybe we're working too hard is not necessarily what I mean, but maybe we're too attentive to what we're doing and thinking there's some hack, some strategy that can get us out of this instead of maybe attending to what God is doing and how God is going to act. And that attending to that kind of action paradoxically means you have to stop. You have to let go. You have to take on a different vision. You have to be attentive in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to push at towards in the book. Yeah.
Because it sounds like you're basically saying, well, there's a problem in the church, and the church starts to realize that now. At least it's in American context, they start to realize it now, and they're looking for the solutions, but they try to find the solutions in the places that got them in this mess in the first place, right?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And we do. We it's true. There's a crisis. Like I think people should just, you know, shut us off if it was like, you know, everything's fine. You know, there's no crisis. Why are you so worried? There is a crisis, and maybe to be a Protestant is always to feel like there's a crisis. You know, like we're the people of crisis. It's just that I think the direction of our crisis, the way we interpret what the crisis is not quite right, and we interpret the crisis as a loss of resources or relevance. The church isn't relevant anymore. We got to get relevant again. Because we're not relevant, we don't have enough resources. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. You know, so we need
economic way of thinking. Actually.
It's a very, very economic way of thinking, and so we have to solve that problem. And what the book tries to propose is that the crisis we have here is a crisis of being able to be attentive to a living, speaking God, and even have an imagination that there is a living, speaking God. And I think what it means to live in a secular age is not that fewer and fewer people go to church. Happens. But really what it means to live in a secular age is to inherit a kind of framework where you can go a long way without thinking about God. And in many ways we all become, and I mean all of us, even our pastors, become in many ways functional atheists.
Right.
You know, that you can go a long way without ever thinking about it. I have pastors in English-speaking world who will say things like, "Man, if I'm really honest, I haven't thought about God in months. I mean, I've preached a sermon every month, but really, really thought about God, really attended to God in my life? No." Or, you know, I often use the analogy where you'll overhear someone in a coffee shop say, like, "I was going to this church, but, you know, I got really burnt out." Which is another interesting phenomenon. And then, you know, so I've just decided I'm going to take a break from God for a while. And the fact that you could overhear that, be like, get that. I understand that. Is completely only our epoch of time. Like if a medieval person heard someone say, "I'm taking a break from God for a while," it'd be like trying to say, "I'm going to take a break from breathing for a while." You know, like it just wasn't possible. How could you ever live in this world? How could you be a human being and not have God before you every second of every day? And even the ways you talk and the things you see, God was everywhere. And for us now, it's, you know,
we're basically, in your analogy, we're equating God with church. And when we're no longer in church, then God's no longer visible.
Yeah. And even when we are in church, we start to think our issue is not that we're sinners before a holy God. We think, well, the issue is that roof could leak and then we're in trouble. The issue is, where are all the young people? The issue is, it used to be when I was going to this church 40 years ago, and my kids were young, we had a big youth ministry program. Now we don't. That's the problem. Not that I can even sit in this church and not really have the pastor say, "Hear today the word of the Lord," and I can be thinking, okay, what time does my football team play? You know what I mean? Like I there's a certain sense where you actually have to do quite a bit of mental work just to remember that now we are hearing the Holy Scriptures. You know what I mean? Like that just isn't kind of obvious, that just doesn't slap you in the face. You know, like that becomes, I think, the kind of dynamics of the kind of secular age we're talking about.
It's like those relationships have become mute in the
absolutely.
words of Rosa. They don't resonate anymore.
But Andrew, what's at stake in your opinion for the church?
Yeah, well, what's at stake ultimately, I mean, this is going to sound incredibly pietistic, but what's really at stake is what it means to really be faithful. But more so, what's at stake is the consoling, renewing work that God is doing within the world. And so what I mean is that, and this is the kind of, back to the practical theology, like what I want to attend to as a practical theologian is divine action. God acts in the world. And so what's at stake is we could end up having essentially religious clubs that have no imagination, no practices, no visions, no ways of living where divine action is operative, where there is such a thing as divine action. And now, that's not to say that the sovereignty of God wouldn't continue to reign, that God wouldn't continue to do work, but the church could become unfaithful in the sense of where it's attending to its own survival more than it's attending to God's work. And so I think that's essentially what's at stake here. I want what's at stake not to just be, well, like the goods of religion are at stake, or a kind of moral framework for humanity. Like people won't be good people if there isn't religion. I think really what's at stake is this deep way of living before God that renews and heals and gives us life out of our deaths. You know, that you talk about Gen Zers into despair. I mean, there's no larger story that their meaning, that their suffering has any redemptive quality to it, or that there's any kind of way that God meets it and renews through it. It just becomes meaningless. And I think one of the really beautiful things about Protestantism particularly, but the Christian narrative overall, and particularly a kind of certain Pauline perspective, is that God becomes present and near in brokenness and suffering. And that incredible meaning comes, the meaning of the divine entering into the human and speaking a word.
And God's sufficiency.
It happens in those very moments. So that seems really at stake to me.
So that means you propose a way of waiting, so to say, for God. Can also imagine some of our listeners thinking, well, that sounds quite passive, doesn't it? I mean, you probably get that question a lot.
Well, it is passive. And in many ways, there is a kind of passivity to it. So a few things to say to get into that. I mean, first of all, when even I admit it's passive, I'm sure some listeners and viewers, that feels repulsive. You know, there's a certain kind of repulsiveness to it, which we should interrogate. Why does that feel so repulsive? And there's something inherent, I think, within a certain kind of late capitalist, late modern society that really tells us that waiting is wasting. And the worst thing you can do, especially when you're in a competitive battle for resources, for
economic
value, is waste. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your money. Don't waste. Zygmunt Bauman has this phrase that I think is really interesting, where he says part of what the modern project is about is taking all waiting out of wanting. So, you know, here's Amazon. Amazon is working hard. All of Silicon Valley, really, their deepest goal, their deepest moral framework. This is a little exclusivist probably for me to say this way, but one of them at least that really mobilizes Silicon Valley is to make things frictionless. You know, so like
instant gratification.
Why should you have to stop to pay. You should. It should be frictional. Everything should be. Why should you have to print out your boarding pass? It should be all frictionless. And really, at one level, that is taking all the waiting out of wanting. And Amazon is working really hard to get drones to deliver. I'm sure someone at Google is working on You Think It. And then all of a sudden it arrives. You know what I mean? Like that
would make your book writing a lot easier.
It would. And you just think of like what AI is supposed to be able to do. Is it supposed to, take all the waiting of writing an essay out? It just writes it for you.
But we've become less patient because of that.
Absolutely, and we've actually seen kind of patience as at least a kind of a waiting as an immoral thing almost. But so this kind of waiting, and I will say that there are really awful ways of waiting and awful things to have to wait for, like a software update.
Okay, yeah.
Like when you're waiting for a software update, it's like, oh my gosh, when is this going to, especially if you're like stuck in the Apple store and you're like, we'll pair your watch to your phone, but we have to first do a software update, and then you're just like sitting there waiting. It's awful. But there is a kind of waiting. I mean, we think of Advent as we're moving, here we are in November moving towards December. Advent is a form of waiting, but it's anticipatory. It's waiting with a bigger story. So this kind of waiting that I'm calling for is an attentiveness, really. It's an waiting attentively, looking for something. Now, why do we have to wait? One of the reasons why waiting is so essential, and I think so essential through the biblical story, is that waiting reminds us that God is God. And that God is uncontrollable. And that we don't get to control God. So we're waiting for God to speak, to move. And that is an anticipation. That's an attentiveness. So it's not waiting as apathy. It's not waiting for a delayed flight. It is waiting with a distinct story, waiting to see something, waiting to anticipate something, waiting actually to be called into something. And I think too often what we feel called by is a certain anxiety within the institution or within ourselves, not waiting to hear called by something outside of us, and particularly called by God. Now, that's no simple thing. That takes a process of discernment. How do we know it's God and not something else? How do we figure that out? But to me, that becomes a really generative way for the church to live. In trying to discern the voice of God. How do we discern, is this Jesus Christ calling us to follow, to use a Bonhoeffer phrase, or is this our own psychology? How do we figure that out? And instead, I think we don't even really tend to care about that anymore. And we're not really care about Jesus calling us to follow. We care about how do we get more people to come.
So if waiting is about being actively receptive and attentive, I get the idea. I got the idea from reading your book that mostly that happens through the church, or the church needs to wait. But a lot of people in the Dutch context are de-churched. So what does waiting look like if you're de-churched? Living in a secular society?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things it tends to mean across our societies is that whether you like it or not, at some point you're going to be forced to wait. And that's going to happen because you find yourself in deep grief or deep loss, or you find yourselves in moments or long-term experiences of disability. It is an illusion and really a sense of denial to assume that you could live a life where you're never thrust into, pushed into waiting. But what becomes, I think, so utterly despairing is you're de-churched or you're not connected to a community. You're forced into waiting because you find yourself in grief. There's really nowhere to find consolation, to find someone who would wait with you. I mean, when you're thrust into that kind of waiting, what you often want is someone to be with you. And now the church is too busy with itself to actually be with the world, to console the world. I mean, it's a profound. I mean, one of the things we talk about here is a watchword, like that you're waiting with a word, an anticipation of this is what we're waiting for. This is how God has moved. And it could be a really profound, and this is what I work in my evangelism book, be profound watchword for the church to think what we do is we follow Jesus Christ into sorrow. Mm-hmm. And when there is sorrow in the world, we go and we're present. Mm-hmm. Not to fix, to be. And we feel like in this process of being with each other, human beings being together around sorrow, there's something sacramental that happens. There's a certain way that Jesus Christ becomes present, working life out of death there. And so what we do is we go into the world, and when there's sorrow, we're present. Mm-hmm. And we're there as a manifestation, as a witness to a God who is present in that. And so I do think that I think that's a calling for the church specifically. Right. Mm-hmm. But there's also a sense that that people outside of the church will have to wait. But then they even more fairly than people within the church should absolutely fear waiting. Mm-hmm. Because waiting means falling behind. Waiting means wasting. And there's no other horizon, like kind of transcendent horizon, no other meaning to that waiting other than failure. Right. You failed. And people who feel that way. Like they found themselves in grief, and they somehow blame themselves that someone they've loved is sick or dying, or the whole system kind of blames you for being someone who finds themselves in deep moments of depression. Like people maybe don't want to stigmatize you, but also don't really want to hang out with you. Like it's just too much of a downer to deal with. I mean, you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, I couldn't go to his funeral; it's just to be too much of a downer." Like, and so I think there's a real beckoning here for, first of all, remembering that we're all going to have to be thrust into waiting at some point, and waiting in isolation, waiting in loneliness. Is devastating. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's potentially, to use a big controversial word, it's potentially demonic. Mm-hmm. No good can come in it. But the Christian story, of course, is that you're not alone in this kind of waiting. Right. That Jesus Christ comes near in that, and the church needs to be present, pointing to that. And so a kind of watchword like we follow Jesus into sorrow could have an incredible impact within how the church relates to the world.
Yeah. So in a way, we've gone full circle. We've come back to this idea of ministry. Yeah. And now in terms of a church's presence or a community's presence in this world in a redemptive way, of compassion, really. Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm also quite curious from my own experience as a pastor in a church, how do we prevent that waiting itself is going to be another activity in the church?
We're going to organize waiting.
Yeah, let's organize waiting. Let's
let's start groups. Let's get T-shirts that say it. Yeah, this is where your theological imagination really matters, because the waiting is not a program of human action. No. It's the shape of divine action. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So reminding people that God is the one who acts. Mm-hmm. And there is a deep, in my work, for good or for ill, the theology of the cross is always there. So Luther's theology of the cross is central. Yeah. So one of the ways that it cannot be a program is in two veins. Is one, to remind us that God primarily moves in suffering, sorrow, brokenness. But that always is to bind us to persons. Mm-hmm. So to use Bonhoeffer again, Bonhoeffer says he has many definitions of what's cheap grace. Cheap grace is when grace is a principle. It's when grace becomes a program. It's when, fascinating, he says it's cheap grace is when grace becomes a doctrine. But ultimately, cheap grace is cheap when it becomes an idea. And costly grace is only one thing. It is the very person of Jesus Christ who follows you, who calls you to follow, who speaks. And so for Bonhoeffer, there's always this contrast between the idea and the person. Yeah. And so when waiting becomes an idea, then it becomes somewhat cheap. Yeah. It becomes overtaken by a kind of consumer mentality or something. Yeah. It becomes a slogan of a jingle, a consumer jingle. When waiting is about sharing in each other's personhood, when it's about seeking for the very person of God in Jesus Christ who comes near to broken persons, yearning persons, even joyful persons, when it becomes about what it means to be together, then it becomes quite profound, and it can't be flattened to just a slogan. So you can always be corrupted by thinking, our issue is loss of resources, loss of relevance. Now waiting will become a way to win resources and win relevance. Yeah. Then we've backed ourselves back into the problem.
And that's the difference, I think, between a jingle and a watchword.
Yes.
Because you use the word watchword, which looks a lot like the Dutch words translated as password. Yeah. It's not the same.
No.
Wachtwoord and watchword. But a watchword, by that you mean something that came out of a lived experience of a community, right? Yeah. That is embodied in the story of a church, which embodies also the process of waiting itself. I start to think that the way you describe waiting for God to act, it requires a lot more faith, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite costly.
Yeah.
You know, that's part of the issue is we shouldn't deny that to wait for God.
Yeah.
Well, we're back to Zygmunt Bauman. Yeah. Taking although waiting out of wanting, that it feels like it's a waste. And it does because it's costly. It's actually costly to do this, and but at the same time, what waiting ultimately is something that's fundamental to the church. Yeah. It's prayer. Prayer is a form of waiting. It's an attentive waiting. I mean, in all discourses and dialogue, any good conversation demands waiting. Yeah. That you are in conversation. The worst conversations any of us ever have is when you're talking to someone, they're just being silent because they're waiting for you to stop your word hole so then they can say their part. You know what I mean? Like, that's the worst kind of conversation because you know that they're paused, but they're not waiting. No. They're not listening. They're not attentive to what you're saying. They're just waiting for their turn. And I fear the church has kind of done that too often, that we haven't actually really listened. Listened to our neighbor, but also really listen to our neighbor because we're listening for God. But it is costly. It absolutely is costly. And I have no solution. And I live this. I mean, my wife is a pastor. She's in a very beautiful, small city church in Minneapolis. But it is a very fragile place. Yeah. And what I mean by that is they discover weird, musty smell in the attic. Yeah. They discover that there's rot all across the roof. That we'll never recover financially. All of a sudden there's a $600,000 bill. We'll never recover. So it's a fragile place. It's absolutely fragile. And becoming a kind of waiting, attentive, attuned to divine action community does not rescue you from being fragile. But the question is, why are we so obsessed with controlling everything to the point that we're never fragile? And part of it is because we've denied the most brute fact of a human life, of human existence, that you're going to die. So this is a weird kind of society as a secular one because we can go a long way without thinking about God. But one of the reasons we can do that is we can go a long way without thinking about the fact you're going to die.
That life is ending.
And you remind congregations, on a Sunday morning, just reminder, we're all going to die. No one gets off this planet alive. At least in my country, people get very angry with you. Like they do not want to be reminded that they're gonna die. So at that level, we're all fragile. But we really do have this late modern illusion that we can somehow get enough resources to package ourselves up enough that we can be beyond fragility. And yet there is no way.
So in a way, this message of waiting as the way out for the church is from what I understand, is a hopeful message, at least for those who are despairing, who are angry, because it says that there's meaningfulness in the waiting, because that right there in that liminal space that you've been thrust in by life, that's where God is somehow going to show up. And there are redemptive qualities in suffering.
Yes, I think it becomes the most meaningful place to be. And it's the most meaningful not because the human agent, not because the person creates the meaning, but because God arrives there. God shows up there. God moves there. And yes, that's a claim of faith, but it's also a claim of centuries of people who've discovered that what is broken, God becomes near to. What is dying, God brings life to. That kind of paradoxical reality. What's foolish becomes wise. Like all of that. It's the way into meaning. It's just no wonder, back to our larger society, that our biggest issue as late modern people is being thrust into meaninglessness. To try to avoid all suffering, all pain, will end up giving you the backlash of a kind of deep, thinned out existence without much meaning in it. And so there's something really hopeful that God can move, and God will move to bring life to death. And so is the church brave enough to share in those existential moments with each other? Or are we just really worried about the institutional survival? And I don't want to downplay some of that, because it matters. Some of the institutional structures matter. So I'm not the kind of punk rock guy that says just tear down all the institutions, but it is a big danger that they become idolatrous. And maybe that's ultimately where I'm trying to turn us to wait on a living God.
Almost at the end of this interview, one final question that remains with me. We've talked about generations. You said some things about the age of despair for younger generations. What would you, for our listeners who are mostly young adults, if you're a listener and you are thinking, what would the watchword be for our younger generations? Do you have any suggestions for a watchword, a motto that you would give to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, I think it would be very hard to find a watchword across a generation, because I think it is so particular.
Of course.
And I guess maybe this comes back to my practical theology perspective, that it's in a community that's sharing, that's an embodied community living together, that we find these watchwords. But maybe one would be, one of the more powerful watchwords that I've used as an example to describe this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s during the Civil Rights Movement, where he was in the midst of a Montgomery boycott, and it wasn't going well. And he gets a phone call in the middle of the night, and someone on the other line says, "I'm going to bomb your house." He's got an infant, his first child, sleeping. He can't sleep. He starts to realize that this isn't going well. I mean, the boycott is not going well, and he feels like he's failing. And so he finds himself at his kitchen table, and it becomes his kitchen table confession, where he doesn't know what else to do but to pray. And as his middle of the night coffee is cooling, he prays and says, "God, I can't do this. I'm failing." And he hears God say, "Martin, when there's no way, I'll make a way." And that became his watchword that really mobilized the Civil Rights Movement. And then he preached a sermon in Chicago called "The God of the No Way Who Makes a Way." And so maybe in some sense, as we move forward here, and for a generation that feels quite despairing, maybe what the way forward isn't to say to you, it's not that bad. I mean, how bad can it be when you have so many streaming services? You know what I mean? Like, it becomes really easy to say, "Come on, buck up. It's not that bad." Instead, maybe the real way forward is to say, "Yeah, it is bad. But nevertheless, always remember that the God of Israel, the God made known in Jesus Christ, that when there's no way, this God makes a way." And maybe that becomes a watchword for a generation, is that in confession of the no way, also start to prepare yourself for a very new way to come, and that God will be faithful to bring a new way out of no way.
That sounds hopeful. Thank you very much for this conversation. En jij heel erg bedankt voor het luisteren. Mocht je meer willen weten, kijk even op onze website begrijphetleven.net. Je kunt er ook een berichtje even naar ons sturen. Mocht je nog ideeën of suggesties hebben voor onze podcast, maak daar gebruik van. Check ook even onze socials. Bedankt dat je dit volledige uur met ons hebt meegeluisterd. Wij worden mede mogelijk gemaakt door de Unie en ABC gemeente en door de Maatschappij van Welstand. En we danken in dit geval ook uitgeverij Boekencentrum Kok heel hartelijk voor het interview met Andrew. Tot de volgende. Hoi.